It was a year like no other, wasn't it? The world changed. You probably changed, your life changed, your workplace changed, your ecclesia has changed. And there are so many things in 2020 that we will look back on to see that something has changed in a certain way. When we look at this year, there's a lot that we could be talking about in 2020. There, of course, is COVID, which has caused over 2 million deaths so far, and this year's going to be worse, suggests the WHO. There's been Australian fires last year, and we're reminded of them just this last weekend in this city. There's been floods, terrible floods in Australia, and we saw just a little example of that on Monday in this city. We saw the Black Lives Matter re-emerge. It's been around for years. Remember those iconic words, "I can't breathe." We saw the Beirut explosion and the outcomes in Lebanon as a result of that foolish political stewardship. We saw China and America in the South China Sea. We saw China and America tensions generally for the entire year, and Australia. And Mr. Morrison has been caught up in all of that. And of course, we had the recent election in the United States between Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden. It's a huge year by any measure. But I don't really want to talk about much of that at all tonight. I want to just focus on one part of this incredible year, and that is all of those events that led up to further outworking of the prophecies, the infallible prophecies in Ezekiel 38. Because last year, more than any other year in the history of man, there was greater outworking in the prophecies of this chapter. 2020 was the year of Ezekiel 38. It moved massively. Let's remind ourselves about the key parties in this chapter. First of all, as our brother Jesse read, there's some northern invaders. And then they come down and they invade a very confident target in Israel. And then there's a whole lot of concerned objectors that say, "Hey, what are you doing here?" And the fourth party, so there's three on the screen, the fourth party is our God and Christ and the saints, that's you and me. And we come and we intervene and we beat the northern invaders, and they are completely demolished. That's a very simple structure, isn't it? Those invaders at the top, they come down to a very confident target, and some objectors say, "Whoa," and then God intervenes. There's four parties in this chapter. So let's have a look at those parties. Let's have a look at the first. The first is in verse 2, when we have reference to Gog. And Gog, you'll know a lot of this, brothers and sisters. Gog means a roof or a mountain, or the highest, or the one at the top. He's the prince of Russia, the king of the north. Gog is the leader. Gog is in charge. He's a strong man. Whoever this man is, Gog is a strong man. He is the leader of the northern invaders. And he's the chief, or as the word means, he's the prince of Rosh, and Brother Thomas points that out in Help Us Israel, and we know this too. It's the most ancient name, Rus or Rosh, of Russia. So he's the chief of Rosh. And also Magog, he's of the land of Magog. And what's important about Magog? Well, Magog is where Ukraine is today. And Mr. Putin, shown on the screen, has come in and wanted to take over Ukraine. And why is that? Because Ukraine and Russia and Belarus all have their ancestors, their forefathers in Kiev, in Ukraine, in Magog. That's where Russia comes from, in Kiev, in Ukraine, in Magog. That's why he invaded Ukraine. And there's Meshech, there's the area of Moscow, and there's Chibul, the region of Chybalski. And so we get this picture, brothers and sisters, that there's this whole area of ancient Russia, modern Russia, and spilling over into Eastern Europe. From east to west is encapsulated under the leadership, the headship of this Gog. He's a very, very powerful leader. Let's just talk about Russia. And in particular, let's just talk about its president, Mr. Putin. You know, until he came and first stood for presidency in 1999, he had never ever stood as a candidate in an election, ever. Ever. Not once in his life. He was never a mayor, he was never a councillor, he was never an MP, he never ever stood for an election. His first election was as the president of Russia. And he got there, and he won. And every election since then have been a landslide. And as The Economist just last year records, the basis for his power, and he has power like no other on this earth. The basis for his power is not in the State Duma, not the parliament, but it lies in the fact that the Kremlin's united Russia has a majority in every legislative assembly, in every region, and in every major city's council. There is no other power in Russia. And people may not like him, but he rigs things and he gets impressive turnouts and impressive ballot figures and impressive election results. Mr. Putin rules Russia. Now, brothers and sisters, I'm not going to tell you tonight that he is Gog, but he feels and acts and sounds like a Gog. There may be a Gog after him, but this man fits all the things of the Gog. We need to have a little look back over where he's come from, where Russia's come from. You recall, and some may be very young in this hall, who would have been born since that time in 1991 when the USSR dissolved. And it was a terrible time. The economy and the armed forces were in tatters, and Russia's once mighty armed forces were laid low. There's reports that bus drivers in Moscow earned more than fighter pilots after that. There's reports of army generals being charged for sending out MiG-29 fighter jets to have drag races with cars in Germany. That's the corruption after 1991, when the USSR just collapsed and disintegrated. All of those countries went their own way. And it was usual to regard Russians as perennial losers. And that's because they lost 14 countries. Those 15 countries that made up the USSR all disintegrated, and they became 15 individual entities. Now that's 30 years ago, 1991, 30 years this year. It's almost ancient history. A lot of us wouldn't have known that. A lot of us would have been born since then. This is still in the very front of Mr. Putin's mind. This is like yesterday. This grieves him immensely. And so he wrote this article, this book on Kremlin winter, which I highly recommend. This is what Mr. Putin says. He's not nostalgic about communism. It's not communism itself, but is bitter about the breakup of the USSR, which in April 2005 he described as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Putin said, "I'd like to repeat my argument that the Russian people became the biggest divided people in the world, and that's an absolute tragedy. The greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century." You serious, Mr. Putin? Yeah, you've got 2 world wars to select from. You've got a revolution in China. You've got a Jewish Holocaust. And yet he says the greatest geopolitical catastrophe in that entire century was the breakup of the USSR. See, we don't get Russia until we put ourselves into Mr. Putin's mind. He grieves that. Doesn't care about communism. He grieves the breakup of the old empire, and he wants it back. Now, brothers and sisters, the country of Russia, which was in a terrible state after the dissolution of the USSR, has recovered incredibly. Principally due to a surge in oil and gas prices. There's some impressive numbers here. In 2017, national debt had reduced from 92% of GDP to less than 12%. That's good. You compare 82% in the US and 47% in Australia. They are remarkable figures. And all foreign debt had been paid off, every bit of it. And how would that happen? Not because Mr. Putin's necessarily smart or they'd gone through economic reform, or rather, the price of oil went up. And that's all Russia does. They sell hydrocarbons and some aluminium and a lot of arms. But essentially, that's all they do, is they sell hydrocarbons. And you can see there in that first little period up until Mr. Putin started in about year 2000. The price of crude oil just sat very flat, little blips each year. And then as soon as he came to power, look what happened, brothers and sisters, up and up and up and up. And yes, there was a big recession in the GFC in 2008. And yes, the introduction of fracking in America brought that price down as well. But Russia has done incredibly well. Did you know that Russia currently sits on one of the world's largest gold and foreign exchange reserves? It's worth nearly 570 billion US dollars. And it's just sitting there for a rainy day when they need it. They're not suffering from COVID. They're not suffering from oil right now. They've got reserves and they've got hardly any debts. They have recovered incredibly. They are an amazing country. Now, Mr. Putin won re-election for his fourth term as president in 2008, and he had a thumping 77% of the vote in 2018, his best result ever, which made him happy, but helped by the fact that his principal opponent, which is a man you might know as Alexei Navalny, was barred from the contest because he was in jail with trumped-up charges. Here he is here. And you might also know that he spent the last number of months in Germany recovering from a coma, having been poisoned by a Russian military nerve agent called Novichok. And he's since come back to Russia. He flew back voluntarily. He's the only opposition leader, the only opposition person of any worth. And he flew back, and as soon as he arrived in Russia and crossed the border, he was arrested and charged and put in jail. And that's what happens when you challenge Mr. Putin. So what's happened in Russia last year? Well, the biggest thing that happened in Russia was its change to its constitution. Don't you love this title in The Economist magazine? Russia's president, reluctantly agrees to 16 more years in power. And this is what happened. Last year, on the 10th of March, the Russian Duma, the parliament, approved an amendment to the country's constitution that would involve the resetting of the clock that bars anyone from sitting more than 2 terms. So in Russia, terms are for 6 years, 2 terms are for 12 years. And you might recall that Mr. Putin went for 12 years and then swapped out as Prime Minister, then swapped back in, simply so he could keep going. So he's in his 4th term, which means 24 years. Year 2000 to year 2024, he'll stop. But this new constitution just happens to have a little clause in it that says the clock gets reset. And in 2024, he can now, because the constitution changes have been passed, he can sit for a further 2 terms after that. That's another 6 and another 6, 12 years. That'll make 2036 if he wins those 2 terms, which he should. That'll make him the longest serving president. It's as long as Ivan the Terrible ruled. He is a very, very strong Gog. Oh, another wonderful article in The Economist, Glued to the Throne. In his annual State of the Union speech, he announced a radical overhaul of the Russian constitution. This bombshell was followed by another. Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev resigned along with the entire cabinet. In the past 20 years, Putin's regime has killed too many people and misappropriated too many billions to make it plausible that he would ever voluntarily want to give up power. Why would you give that up? He cannot run again for president when his term expires in 2024, so everyone has always assumed that one way or another he would game the rules to remain top dog. And he has. In reality, the details don't matter much. Russia is a dictatorship masquerading as a democracy. So what Mr. Putin did is he advised everyone that the changes would only come into effect with the endorsement of the Constitutional Court, which he happens to run, and also with the approval of the Russian people. But it wasn't a proper referendum. It had no precedent or legal basis at all. There were no thresholds to cover, no minimum number of people. There was no independent monitoring of any of the voting, and it didn't follow any clear rules. And after all of that, on the 1st of July last year, the Russians voted to approve a series of changes to the Constitution. 206 changes in a single yes-no question. 206 changes, one of which was that Mr. Putin has the clock reset and he can now be president for a further 2 terms. The Economist said that it was less brazen than rolling tanks into Red Square and declaring a coup, but only just. And that's where he is. He's the Gog. He's the man at the top. Russia is in control. Now, they're a very strong nation, brothers and sisters and young people. Just a couple of little aspects of their armaments. This is a trial of a hypersonic nuclear missile. It's called Zircon. And they tested their new Zircon hypersonic nuclear missile on Mr. Putin's birthday last year, his 68th birthday, on the 9th of October. It's described as a scary nuclear missile that's too fast for anyone to stop, literally. And so it travels through the air at more than 9,600 kilometres an hour. That's 8 times the speed of sound. This particular missile was tested in a naval ship, from a naval ship in the White Sea north of Russia. It successfully hit a target 450 kilometres away in just 270 seconds to get there. That's their capacity. It's got a range of 1,000 kilometres, and it takes just 270 seconds to travel 450 kilometres. This is where Mr. Putin is going. Their military strength, says the caption on the slide there, is at its highest since the Cold War, said the Daily Mail, with its nuclear weapons and Russian Air Force particularly stronger. Here's some more stats. So Russian military expenditure has nearly doubled from 2005 to 2018. 13 years, doubling of its expenditure per annum. And much of that money has been spent on kit, they call it. And interestingly, of that kit in 2007, 99% of their kit was graded as legacy kit. And by legacy kit is meant that it's more than 3 decades old. You get the picture? In 2007, 99% of their armour was more than 30 years old. Mr. Putin has changed that so that at the end of that period, ending in 2018, just looking at warplanes alone, they've gone from 97% legacy to being 71% modern. They've just turned that around. They used to have ancient fleets and ancient aircraft, and now they've changed that from being a legacy fleet to being a modern one. But another article notes that they're not just better armed. It's nice to have better arms, it's important, it's powerful, but they're not just better armed, they're also more fleet-footed. Around 5,000 of their airborne troops are said to be on 2 hours' notice. You've got to be in the plane, 2 hours, anytime, anywhere, 5,000, 2 hours' notice. Britain's Chief of Defence Intelligence has concluded that Russia has traded mass for tempo. They're fast. Did you pick that up in Ezekiel 38 tonight? They can move real fast. Now, Russia's now in the Middle East. They've always been there in varying ways. They love being in the Middle East, but their big opportunity came in 2015 when Mr. Putin decided to send some modest Russian forces to save Syrian President Assad from imminent defeat. And that was gratefully accepted by Mr. Assad, and Russia has been in Syria ever since. You know that. In late 2019, the United States abandoned Syria and said, no, it's not for us, and they abandoned it to Syria. And their defence secretary said that they ordered a withdrawal of American troops from northern Syria, a decision that will effectively cede control of the area to the Syrian government and Russia. And then they drove out. And Mr. Trump said it was time for us to get out and let others such as Russia and Iran figure the situation out. So America's left, Russia's in, and they're getting bigger all the time. And it was as if Mr. Trump packaged up a nice gift-wrapped Syria and gave it to the Russians. Ofer Zalzberg, who is a Jerusalem-based senior analyst for the International Crisis Group, says, I'd say that this week, and that was the week that America left, I'd say that this week Russia became the sole global power willing to actually use military power in the Middle East. I wonder if that person had been reading Ezekiel 38. Now, brothers and sisters, have you considered how close Russia is to Israel? I don't know about you, but when I was younger and listening to Ezekiel 38 lectures on Sunday nights, like we still have, and was an important part of my upbringing, I just had this picture that Russia would just sweep down. One night they'd be in Moscow, the next night they'd be in Jerusalem. And it's been beautiful to watch their stealth. Not sweeping down, they've been invited down. Would you like me to come into Syria? Yes, please come into Syria. And they're there, and they're on the edge of Israel. How close are they? Well, here's a map of Syria and the Russian military bases shown in a dark brown. And you can see on this, in the green circle on the bottom left, that there is a Russian military base, and this information is accurate as at the 13th of July last year. There's a Russian observation post at Quneitra, which is on the border of the Golan Heights, on the border of Israel. There are 5 Russian military bases between 50 and 100 kilometres of that Golan Heights border. Now, how can we illustrate that? That's like the Russians being, if we're in this hall, the Russians being between Cullington and Murray Bridge. That's where Russia is from where we are sitting tonight. That's how close they are today from the Promised Land. And Ezekiel 38 had all of this in prophecy. Now, who's with Russia? They're there. They're on the edge of the land. Who's with Russia? Well, in verse 5, we have Persia as the first on the list, and that's important. Persia is modern Iran, and we note that it's the first on the list of Russia's partners, and Iran has a stated purpose of erasing Israel from the map. This is what Major General Hassan Salami has said: this sinister regime of Israel must be wiped off the map. This is no longer a dream, it's an achievable goal. Iran hates Israel, it hates the West, and it's friends with Russia. So what does Iran do? Well, Iran doesn't have any economic might. It sells a bit of oil, but it doesn't do too well. It doesn't even have the conventional military power to occupy another country. Its principal processes in empire building are in chaos. So what they do is they sponsor local militia groups as proxies, like the Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in the Gaza Strip and the Houthis in Yemen. And they arm them up and they give them everything they need, and then they say, you fire those rockets at Israel or at the government in Yemen. And that makes a very weak country a very strong country. That's what they do to act in power. Now, there are threats, a big threat. They're not just a threat because they hate Israel with every fibre of their body. They're a threat because they're developing nuclear capacity. So they have a nuclear enrichment program. Israeli intelligence warns that if Iran continues its steps in defiance of a 2015 nuclear deal, it could have enough enriched uranium to produce an atomic warhead on a missile at the end of this year, at the end of 2021, 11 months away. This is their table of enrichment and the reports by the International Atomic Energy Agency. In March, they had more than a tonne of low enriched uranium. In June, they had 1.5. In September, they had 2 tonnes. In November, 2.44 tonnes. That's the latest report of how much uranium that Iran has. 2.44 tonnes is enough for 2 nuclear warheads when it's fully enriched. That's 12 times the amount that under that 2015 nuclear limitation deal they were allowed to produce. They were allowed to have 200 kilograms. They've already produced 2.44 tonnes. That's why Israel's nervous. So what have they done? Well, a war at some stage will happen between the two. Iran's getting closer and closer to that nuclear weapon capacity and capability. It's bent on the destruction of Israel. It hates every single thing there is about Israel. And there will be war. But last year there were 2 critical assassinations to slow the pace. One at the start of the year and the other at the end. The first was this gentleman. He was assassinated just over 12 months ago on the 3rd of January. General Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC. He headed the Quds Force, Quds, Iran's premier terrorism elite force, and in this capacity he led Iran's foreign policy in the Middle East. Now, this man was mean. He stood up the strongest non-force state in the world, the strongest non-state force in the world, the Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Hezbollah's arsenal is about 150,000 rockets. They were all provided by this man, and they all point directly at Israel. The Hezbollah has more firepower than most NATO countries. And this is what this man was responsible for. He wanted to build a second Hezbollah in Syria, and Israel has so far successfully prevented that through close to 1,500 strikes on Iranian establishments in Syria. Now, this man was killed for all of that by an American drone in January last year. That's his funeral. There were at least 1 million people there in Tehran, it's estimated. The gathering stretched nearly 6 kilometres long. 56 people died and 213 people were injured just in a stampede at the funeral itself. He was a power broker in Iran. He was number 2, and he was the one that incensed people against Israel. Donald Trump said from the White House on the day of the assassination, "He's made the death of innocent people his sick passion. Today we remember and honour the victims of his many atrocities, and we take comfort in knowing that his reign of terror is over." But Mr. Putin didn't say that. This is what Mr. Putin said. He moved to heighten his role after that killing. Russian President Vladimir Putin will look to boost his country's standing in the Middle East following the Trump administration's decision to assassinate the Iranian military leader Qasem Soleimani last week. It provides Putin with new opportunities to achieve 2 of his long-standing goals, undermining US credibility and expanding Russia's footprint across the Middle East. Trump condemned him as a terrorist. Mr. Putin said, "This is an opportunity and I need to move in." And then there was a second assassination at the end of the year with Hizradar, and he was a nuclear scientist, and you probably know this occurred in November last year. A 59-year-old nuclear scientist, he was gunned down, and he was the architect and brains behind Iran's nuclear weapons program. And because of his vital role in Iran's nuclear program, he was included in Foreign Policy's list of the world's 500 most powerful individuals. Now, yeah, okay, that was back in 2013. But put that into context, no one knows much about this man. You can't Google much about him. There's no photos other than one there. No one knows anything about him. and yet this list had him as one of the most powerful 500 individuals in the world. Iran's foreign minister tweeted that there were serious indications that Israel was involved, and that was fair. And its assassination apparently involved 52 people, plus bombs and snipers and a motorbike gunman, in a precisely coordinated execution as he was driven to his mountain retreat in a convoy of 3 bulletproof cars. Iran is very big. Persia is on the front of the list for a reason. Their nuclear capacity is growing and growing and growing. Who else is there in verse 5? Well, Ethiopia and Libya with them, and they're on the fence at the moment. They're friends with Israel, but they're also friends with Russia, and they'll end up on Russia's side. And Gomer's there with all her hordes, and Gomer, of course, is the Gauls. And I think to myself, how's France going to be there? We've seen the pictures of the Eiffel Tower. We may have toured France. How's this going to happen? But right down the bottom of that slide, Mr. Macron has said, Europe needs to develop a military force on its own. We need to start rebuilding relations with Russia. Russia's no longer our enemy, he said. Macron tells NATO before a summit. They'll join Russia. There is no doubt about that. And then there's Turkey. And Turkey is very strange. They're a member of NATO. They're a member of the very organisation that was designed to protect them from Russia. And yet he's closer today with Russia than he has ever been. And here are the 3 presidents of Iran and Russia and Turkey. Best buddies. Turkey is expanding its footprint across the Arab world, says The Economist in August last year. Turkey is now a force to be reckoned with along a 600-kilometre stretch of the Mediterranean. They are a genuine power broker in the area. And there's an emerging Russian-Turkey alliance. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Tuesday, this is December 29, that Moscow and Ankara's military cooperation would not be deterred by the US sanctions that they happened to have through acquiring some Russian missile defence systems. They are close. So we see this picture, Russia and Persia, Iran and Turkey to Gomer, and all of those countries have come together. They are bonding, they are very close. What is the commentators saying about Turkey? Well, the President Erdogan has said that Jerusalem is our city. We will follow this to the end. Turkey's hostility to Israel will remain a feature of its politics. Turkey hates Israel. Turkey's pursuit of a regional condominium with Russia. They want to be buddies. They want to work together. Turkey's joined Russia in attempts to unify the Palestinian groups. Israel has classified Turkey as a challenge to its national interests for the very first time ever. And with Turkey drifting away from the West and towards Iran and Russia, some see those 3 as forming a rejectionist bloc in the Middle East. All of those countries have come together, and all of that happened last year. Ever thought where those countries come from? They all come from Japheth and Ham, all of them. From Genesis chapter 10. Who comes from Shem? Well, Sheba and Dedan, from Keturah through Abraham. So all of those countries will be from Japheth and Ham, and they're gathering together. And brothers and sisters, the thing that hits me as I go through those verses is how big they are. Verse 4, all of the army. Verse 4, a great company. Verse 5, all of them armed. Verse 6, many people. Verse 9, they'll come like a storm and a cloud, and they'll cover the land. Verse 15, many people, a great company, a mighty army, a cloud to cover the land. This is going to be the biggest force that sets off the biggest war that this world has ever seen. And Mr. Putin has this advantage. The bottom half of that slide, his willingness to throw away the post-Cold War rulebook and his ability to use force has given him a tactical advantage over the West. He'll do anything, and he will. And so down they come, and they come to Israel, who's dwelling Well, they're dwelling securely, aren't they? They're dwelling safely. They're dwelling confidently. In fact, the verse says they'll dwell safely. The Hebrew word is bitak. It's a place of refuge. They're very happy and they're safe. And that comes through right through this section. So while the Gogian group, the northern invaders, are big, colour it in when you get home tonight, Israel, well, they're confident. They're pretty good. They dwell safely. In fact, they don't even have walls around their villages. They're at rest. They dwell safely. There's no walls, there's no bars, there's no gates. The people of Israel dwell safely. They're very secure. Russia's big, Israel's confident. Now, Israel has some threats. They have threats from Iran with their nuclear and from their military build-up in Syria and through the missiles and rockets that come down from the Hezbollah, but they're supremely confident in these areas because of these, the Iron Dome and the Iron Beam. Now, the Iron Dome is an all-weather air defence system that we're probably familiar with. It intercepts and destroys short-range rockets that are fired from 4 to 70 kilometres away. And just last year, in August 2020, they introduced the Iron Beam. So this is an air defence system that's designed to destroy short-range rockets with a range of up to 7 kilometres. Anything between here and 7 kilometres away, Iron Beam will destroy. They've got it all covered. They've got Iron Dome, and they're looking to increase that technology so that it can cover anything up to 250 kilometres and do 2 at a time, and Iron Beam will get anything up to 7 kilometres. They're confident. And they've got lots of money, lots of technology, even lots of energy. They've got huge oil fields with the Tamar and the Leviathan gas fields. And they've got another election happening at the moment. They're going to have their 4th election in just a couple of years. But they have this incredible person who's leading there in Mr. Netanyahu, the country's longest serving Prime Minister, nearly 15 years, an international statesperson, Israel's most gifted politician in a generation. He is brilliant. I don't know what's going to happen at the next election. I think he'll get there, but we don't know. But he is brilliant. Why would Russia invade Israel? Well, the answer's given in verse 12. They've come to take a spoil, says the objectors. What sort of spoil? Do they want that strategic area of Israel and the Suez? Do they want to control Israel's resources and their incredibly good technology? Is it in response to a massive disruption to regional peace? Has Israel just gone off and blown up Iran's new nuclear plant? Is it in response to international disruption of oil and gas flows? Is it opportunistic during COVID? Everyone's sick. We're not, says Russia. We're off. They're going to come down. They're very big. Israel is very confident, and they're going to invade. And then there's some objectives, and they're sitting down there and they're concerned. And one of the people who has made the principal development on the part of the objectors is Mr. Trump. You know, people have called him loony. He may have been a poor president, but he's made a greater contribution to Israel as a country than any other US president ever. And he's had the single greatest outworking of Ezekiel 38 than any other US president ever. There's no doubt that he was placed there by God, as unlikely a presidential candidate he was, for his work with the Jews. And yes, his presidency did end just a little while ago with a riot on Capitol Hill, when people just barged in. 4 people died in the rampage. And yes, he was impeached twice. And yes, The Economist magazine did show his face as a cracked man at the end of his 4-year term. But he changed the Middle East forever. So what did Mr. Trump do? What did he do for the Jews? Well, he recognised Jerusalem as Israel's capital. He moved the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. You know, every US president, every single US president since 1995, when a bill was passed to do that, every US president since 95 has said they'd do that, and none did. He was the first, the only one that did that. He closed the PLO office in Washington, D.C. He halted US financial aid to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees. He recognised Israel's sovereignty of the Golan Heights. Russia and Iran and Syria, of course, condemned that. He recognised it. He recognised that the establishment of Israeli civilian settlements in the West Bank was not inconsistent with international law. He said that anti-Zionism is indeed anti-Semitism. He withdrew from Mr. Obama's flawed 2015 Iran nuclear deal, and then he went on and subjected Iran to a maximum pressure group of economic sanctions. He pushed back on Palestinian-based UN bodies, the United Nations, that has a lot of time for Palestinians but no time for Israel. And he said, enough's enough. Come on, guys. He mediated the Abraham Accords. I'm going to talk about them in a minute. And he proposed a 50-page peace plan describing a realistic two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's been nothing like him in the history of the United States. And yes, he was possibly a really poor president. And yes, he did only survive one term, where normally it's so easy to win that second one unless you're doing a really poor job. But God put him there. And let's respect our Father for that. And the things that Mr. Trump has done for the Jews. Now we have Mr. Biden, and he's there with a mop and a bucket to clean up. What do we know about him? Well, he's a self-professed Zionist. He's publicly supported the US brokered normalisation agreements, so that's good. He will keep the US embassy at Jerusalem. He's not going to move that. He's vowed to work closely with Israel to ensure it can defend itself against Iran. In all likelihood, nothing significant that Mr. Trump did will be reversed. He'll keep it all. But unlike his predecessor, he gets that Russia is probably the United States' biggest enemy and threat in this world. And he's got a huge job. And here he is in his gym lifting weight, and at one end he's got a virus, and the other end he's got the world. He's got a massive job to make up for what his predecessor has done. But he will keep on going with what his predecessor did for the Jews. So who are the participants of the objecting group? Well, in verse 13 we have Sheba and Dedan, and we had the merchants of Tarshish, the trading merchants, and we had the young lions of Tarshish. And did you notice that order, brothers and sisters? When I grew up, as you did, and you had your Ezekiel 38 lectures on a Sunday night, we always had these put up, didn't we? And I was directed straight to Tarshish and proven that it was Britain. And then I was directed to all those war posters and how there was the young lions of Britain, Australia, Canada, India and New Zealand. And they're supporting Tarshish and they're objecting, and we hardly spent any time at all on the principal power in this verse. The head of the objectors was Sheba and Dedan. I've got books at home, and you would have them too, that talk about Ezekiel and this chapter, and that say Sheba and Dedan are there, but they speculate how this support is going to happen. They don't know how it's going to happen, because these countries used to hate Israel. They hated Israel like all the Arabs did. And so we went straight to Tarshish, and the book speculated on what would happen. In 2020, Sheba and Dedan emerged. And all of those authors in your bookcase at home, and all those study notes that we used to put out, have found their realisation for these nations last year. What an incredible year. It changed Ezekiel 38. We saw it happen. So Ezekiel 38 and Sheba and Dedan refers to the inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula. And 2020 was marked with the signing of normalisation agreements, making things normal, between Israel and its Arab neighbours. Now you might think that's not as big as it was. This is huge. We're talking about people that don't just not like each other. We're talking about countries that actually hate each other. In some cases, we're talking about countries that would like the other country dead. These countries have slowly turned around. Now, Israel became a very appealing partner for a couple of reasons. One, because they'd been very stable. So through the Arab Springs revolutions, when there was different leaders and upheavals and changes, almost every week, Israel just stayed the same. They're very stable. And also, Arab countries became increasingly scared of Iran as a threat. And they saw in Israel someone that was happy to stand up to Iran and use their military power if they needed to. And so Israel became very attractive. This is a list of the arms sales in the Middle East. This will show you how scared Middle Eastern Arab countries are. In the years 2014 to 18, the Middle East received over a third of the world's arms exports. Incredible. Imported 87% more weapons than in that period than in the previous 5 years. You see, they're scared. This is not flatlining, this is not an annual budget where we buy X arms every year. In that last 5 years, they increased their purchases by 87%. In 2018, Saudi Arabia spent $68 billion on military kit, more than anyone in the entire world, except for America and China. Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has now amassed the world's 8th largest fleet of combat aircraft, number 8 in the entire world. The UAE, which also signed one of the agreements, was the 7th biggest spender during that 5-year period, and tiny Qatar and Oman made up the top 20 military expenditure in the world. What are these guys doing? Because they're scared. And they've come out of nowhere as Sheba and Dedan, and they've jumped off the page of Ezekiel 38, and they've said, we need to get serious. And they've spent lots of money, and they're now friends with Israel. Last year saw that. Well, over a number of years, they've been getting closer and closer. They've been sharing intelligence. In October 2019, Israel announced that they were working on non-aggression treaties. In February last year, an Israeli cycling team took part in the United Arab Emirates tour racing through Dubai. And you might say, so what? That's riding a bike. It's the first time ever in 2020 that Israelis could ride in UAE. In June 2020, the first commercial aircraft from the UAE landed at Tel Aviv Ben Gurion Airport. In June last year, the very, very first commercial flight between the UAE and Israel occurred. Up until that point, you couldn't fly from the United Arab Emirates to Israel directly. And mind you, it was carrying COVID-19 supplies for the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinians said no to them because they've been passed through Israel. In August 2020, plans for the full normalisation of diplomatic relations between Israel and the UAE were announced, and just a few days before the actual ceremony, Bahrain joined them. And there's the signing ceremony, and brothers and sisters, that is an iconic picture for your wall. This is Ezekiel 38 verse 13. This is the books on our bookshelf that said they're going to join, but we're not sure how because they don't like Israel. And in 2020, they signed normalization treaties. And these two take their place, the UAE and Bahrain, as the 3rd and 4th Arab country to open those diplomatic relationships with Israel after Egypt did in 79 and Jordan in 94. They're not small fry. The UAE is the 8th richest country in the world. Bahrain is the 23rd richest. And if they get their extensive capital with Israel's incredible technology, then that area will go ahead in leaps and in bounds. It's called the Abraham Accord because they acknowledge that these nations came from the same ancestor, with Sheba and Dedan coming through Keturah. Now the newspapers thought it was just as big as we do from Ezekiel 38. The New York Times called it a geopolitical earthquake. We know what earthquakes are, they're big. There's 3 huge ones in Revelation. They changed the world. The New York Times said, this is a geopolitical earthquake. This is not small. The National Post said it was a historic shift in Middle East politics. Next time you think of Mr. Trump, just give him some credit for Ezekiel 38 verse 13. He mediated this. He busted his gut to bring it out. He made compromises to get the outcomes that were necessary. Mr. Trump is all over this. And yes, he's gone. And the world thought he was a loony, but he was Ezekiel 38's prime mover. Now the outcomes are all the things that we normally enjoy. There's the exchange of ambassadors, there's direct flights, incredible. Flights were allowed over each other's airspace. There's tourism, they can go to each other's places. Open trade, we can sell to each other and not through a third party where we have to rebrand and rebadge everything. Energy won't be a big part of it, but there will be intelligence sharing, no doubt, and enhanced coordination. And that area is going to just go boom. There's now normalisation agreements with the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and just been added Morocco and Bhutan. Israel is getting very big and they're very secure. And then we get to Tarshish. So that's all Sheba and Dedan. They're important. They're at the head of this verse. And then we get to Tarshish and the merchants of Tarshish, which are Britain and its traders, and that's got to include the United States, and all of the young lions and the Commonwealth countries that we know of. And the sense is that the young lions belong to Tarshish, because they do. They're the traders with all of her young lions. And we've seen Britain over many years develop that area. And here's one of their naval bases in Bahrain, where they set up the permanent military base for the first time in 40 years in Bahrain in 2018. And this gives the UK expansive presence along their key international shipping quotes. When that was set up, the Commodore at the place, Steve Dainton, said, "The aim of the Royal Navy being out here is to enhance and ensure the maritime security in the region." Sounds like a military person, doesn't it? And whether or not that's law and order in the high seas, countering piracy, countering terrorism, making sure that the high seas are all safe for the free flow of commerce and the free flow of trade. Ezekiel 38, verse 13 rather, the traders, the merchants of Tarshish. And there they are trading, and there they are in the Middle East. Now we need to conclude on Brexit. And Brexit, of course, completed. That's the last big thing that happened in 2020. And on December the 24th, just a month ago, the sides agreed a trade deal 50 years later after Britain's membership of the European Union was agreed. The issue was on many platforms, but it was significantly about immigration. And when we say immigration, enlargement of Britain into the EU and vice versa gave many low-paid Europeans a chance to better themselves. You do well if you move from a farm in Poland to Manchester in the UK. So the number of Polish-born residents in the UK increased from a low 56,000 in 2001 to over 900,000 in 2016 when the referendum first took place. Romanians increased from 14,000 in 2004 to over 300,000 when that referendum took place. And Britain just felt that it had lost control of its destiny. We can't do anything, our borders are open, we've got no control. And they were determined to get who lives inside their borders and to work that out. And interestingly, if we were to graph the Remainers, those people who wanted to remain in the EU, and those people who wanted to leave the EU, just that little point in 2016 when the referendum was made that said, yes, we want to leave. And since then, for the past 4 years, the majority has said we want to remain, we want to stay. And God acted, and the UK acted, that at that point there was a national referendum. And just last month, Britain left the EU after 50 years. I was just alive, but I was sucking a dummy at the time. You imagine being a brother or a sister, a discerning brother or sister in 1971, saying, I don't get that. Why is Britain entering the EU? That's just crazy. We've just read Ezekiel 38, and we've got the northern invaders, and they're with Europe, all the way across to France, and they're coming down to invade God's homeland, and Britain's just joined them. I don't get it. And 50 years later, brothers and sisters, God is always right, and Britain has come out. We can thank Russia for a little bit of that. It's a long story in there. A lot of mystery, a lot of deception, a lot of Googling maybe tonight, but Russia was behind a lot of the Brexit outcome. It later transpired that Russian companies had employed devious methods to use Facebook data to discover the identity of voters hostile to the EU and then target them with fake news designed to stiffen their will to vote leave. There's a lot of articles on that, how the Russians influenced the UK to leave the EU. Well, the ructions aren't over. Scotland wanted to stay by a really big majority. We'll have to see what happens there. Northern Ireland wanted to stay by a smaller majority, and the Scots want their independence, and support for Irish unification is growing. But Britain is out of the EU and the deal is done. And this is how Mr. Johnson describes it. The newspaper article was, of course, taken back in December 2019. He says in December 2020, on the right-hand side, the deal is done. We have taken back control of our money, borders, laws, trade, and our fishing waters. The deal also guarantees that we're no longer in the lunar pull of the EU. We're not bound by the EU rules. We will have full political and economic independence from the 1st of Jan 2021. We have got Brexit done. We can now take full advantage of the fantastic opportunities available to us as an independent trading nation, striking trade deals with other partners around the world. I wonder if Mr. Johnson knew a lot about Ezekiel 38 and verse 13. The traders of Tarshish. And that's what they are. Britain has the 5th largest economy in the world. Just yesterday, Mr. Johnson was in India with the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, and he was his guest of honour for Republic Day. They're drumming up business. That's what it's all about, and the merchants are working away. You know, we described the northern invaders, and we said in a slide, they're big. And we described Israel, and we said in a slide, they're secure, they're safe. How do we describe the objectors? Well, there is no description. We don't know anything about their military forces. There's nothing there about an armed response as well. Just surprise. What are you doing here? So brothers and sisters, Russia, at some point, when it doesn't look like it, when they're not expected, when all of the objectors are sitting down there in a friendly way, engaging with that target in Israel, and they feel secure and they feel safe and everything's fine, Russia's going to go bang. And everyone is going to be taken by surprise. And that invasion is going to be as big an invasion as the world has ever seen. And Israel, as strong as they are, will be overcome. They will be defeated. And the objectors will not have answers as good as they are. And that's when the fourth party is going to come. And the Father and the Son and the saints are going to come down, and they will do some invasion of their own. You might have noticed, as Brother Jesse read that chapter, the repetition of God's title and name, Adonai Yahweh, 6 times. It's a feature of all of Ezekiel. It's a feature of chapter 38. He who will be rulers. And God says, I've got some serious military backing of my own. And he's going to come in these last few verses, in verse 18, in a fury, in a heat, the word means, in a rage, in an anger, in a furious indignation. And you look at those verses, brothers and sisters, he's going to unleash every single kind of terror against Gog. He is going to blow them up, and it's going to end a long conflict when the peoples of this world have had little regard for the things of our God. So 2020 changed this world. It changed my life and your workplace and mine and my ecclesia and your ecclesia. And I can promise you that we won't have a 2019 again. The world won't revert. This year's going to be tough. COVID's not going to go away. There's going to be squabbles about vaccines. There's going to be bigger issues. There's going to be stress and turmoil. Life won't be pleasant. But we have confidence that the things of Ezekiel 38 and the prophecies of the Scripture will happen. What a wonderful hope we have, brothers and sisters, and let's hold fast to it. Thank you.